While Europe trembled under the boot of fascism, across the ocean, America stood still, or so it seemed. As dictators rose and democracies fell, the US watched from behind a wall of oceans, swearing never again to another world war. But beneath that isolationist calm, something stirred. Industries booming, ideologies shifting, power consolidating. By the end of the decade, the seeds of a new empire were quietly taking root. This episode explores how America's retreat from global conflict paradoxically laid the foundation for its rise as the world's military superpower, through quiet preparation, industrial evolution, and the birth of a permanent war economy. This is the silent decade that changed everything.
In every war zone, in every era, the United States military has stood at the edge of history. From the smoke of independence to the steel of global war, America's power was built through conflict, sacrifice, and strategy. This is Shadow Force, your mission briefing on the rise of American military power, the wars that shaped it, and the tactics that still echo today. Subscribe now and enter the front lines of real history.
The 1930s in the US were defined by crisis and caution. The Great Depression had shattered economic stability and trust in the system. 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Tent cities, Hoovervilles, lined the outskirts of every major city. Amid such hardship, the horrors overseas felt far away. The rise of Hitler, Mussolini's aggression, Japan's invasion of China. To many Americans, it wasn't our problem. The trauma of World War I was still fresh. Over 100,000 Americans had died in what was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Yet what came after? More conflict, more pain. The lesson seemed clear. Foreign wars only bring American coffins. So Congress acted. In 1935, the Neutrality Acts were passed, legally binding America to stay out of European and Asian conflicts. Even when fascism screamed from Berlin and Tokyo, the US looked away, bound by law, fear, and exhaustion. But while the headlines screamed neutrality, factories kept running. Industrial production in America had slowed in the early 30s, but by mid-decade, it was recovering, fast. War, after all, meant demand: steel, rubber, oil, ammunition, vehicles. And America had what the world needed. U.S. corporations, though neutral, sold supplies to allies and enemies. Ford and General Motors had plants in Nazi Germany. Standard Oil did business with both sides. This wasn't treason, it was capitalism. Behind the scenes, America was becoming the arsenal of the world. By the time Hitler marched into Poland in 1939, the U.S. had already rekindled its industrial fire. Franklin D. Roosevelt was no fool. He read the room. The people wanted peace. But he also understood war was coming. So he walked a razor's edge. Publicly, he defended the Neutrality Acts. Privately, he laid the groundwork for defense. In 1938, he asked Congress for massive military spending increases. Not for war, he said, but for national preparedness. Roosevelt created agencies to coordinate military research and production. He quietly expanded the Navy. He approved deals with defense contractors. He supported the development of strategic technologies: radar, aircraft carriers, long-range bombers. While Europe panicked, America prepared, silently. Even as it stayed out of war, America was already shaping the battlefield. Through economic power, it influenced governments. Through corporate reach, it shaped foreign industries. And through cultural exports, it dominated hearts and minds. Hollywood films reached Germany, France, and beyond. Coca-Cola set up bottling plants overseas. American jazz played in Paris cafes while storm clouds gathered over Europe. Isolation wasn't total. It was tactical. The US was pulling invisible strings without setting foot on foreign soil. By the late 1930s, one thing had become clear. America was no longer just a sleeping giant. It was a giant getting ready to flex. Roosevelt's spending spree fueled a boom in military contracts. Private companies got rich from government deals: Boeing, Lockheed, DuPont. The US military grew quietly in size, scope, and capability. In 1939, the cash and carry policy allowed sales of weapons to Britain and France. It was neutrality, in name only. The foundations were now laid for what would become the military-industrial complex, a fusion of state and corporate power that would dominate post-World War II geopolitics. As the 1940s approached, the illusion of isolation began to crack. Hitler's invasion of Poland, Japan's aggression in the Pacific, the fall of France. America could no longer pretend the war was distant. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 broke the final barrier. US arms flowed to Britain and the USSR. The public still believed in staying out, but Washington had already made its choice. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the US was practically at war. The transition from isolation to intervention was not abrupt. It was a decade-long transformation, engineered behind the scenes. The irony? In trying to avoid war, the US laid the groundwork to lead every war that followed. What began as withdrawal turned into dominance. The factories built in the 1930s would churn out tanks in the 40s and missiles in the 50s. The corporations that armed allies then would supply wars from Korea to Vietnam, Iraq to Afghanistan. Roosevelt's quiet preparation would echo in Eisenhower's famous warning: "Beware the military-industrial complex." By 2025, the US maintains over 750 military bases in 80 countries. It has become the world's referee, police, and sometimes judge. That's the legacy of the 1930s. So, while Europe burned, America paused. It mourned. It rebuilt. It promised peace. But behind the scenes, it prepared. That silent preparation reshaped the world. It ended one war and prepared for every war since. The 1930s weren't just a chapter of withdrawal. They were the prologue to empire.
If you believe military history shaped our world, then you've already joined the force. Hit like, subscribe, and share the mission. Shadow Force continues, and the next chapter awaits.